August 1942. A young Army officer walks into the United States Treasury and asks to borrow 6,000 tons of silver. The bureaucrat across the desk thinks he's lost his mind. But here's what nobody expected. That number would grow to 14,700 tons, or $300 million. Nearly $6 billion today. And every ounce of it would be used for a single purpose: building magnets the size of houses. Magnets that would help separate atoms. Magnets that would help construct the most destructive weapon in human history. The silver wasn't stolen. It wasn't spent. It was borrowed. And almost every troy ounce was returned after the war. This is the story of how America's precious metal reserves helped build the atomic bomb. Welcome back to History of World War II. Subscribe and hit the bell. This story gets stranger than you expect. Picture yourself walking through the marble hallways of the Treasury building in Washington, D.C. Footsteps echoing off stone floors. Armed guards at every checkpoint. Vaults containing gold reserves that back the American dollar. Ahead, an office that controls more wealth than most nations possess. You are Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Nichols, 34 years old, West Point graduate, engineer. And you about to make a request so outrageous that the man across the desk will think you've lost your mind. You sit down opposite Undersecretary of the Treasury, Daniel Bell. His office is immaculate. Photographs of presidents on the walls. Bell is a career bureaucrat, meticulous, the kind of man who has spent his life ensuring that every penny of the nation's wealth is accounted for. You explain that the War Department needs to borrow metal. A lot of metal, for a project so classified that you yourself can barely explain what it's for. Bell asks the obvious question: how much do you need? You reply, 6,000 tons. Silence. Bell's expression shifts from professional courtesy to alarm. Then he asks a question that reveals just how absurd this moment truly is. How many troy ounces is that? You don't know. You've been thinking in tons. The language of engineers. Bell doesn't know either. It's two men sitting in the Treasury of the United States, and neither can do the basic conversion. Growing impatient, you respond, I don't know how many troy ounces we need, but I know I need 6,000 tons. That is a definite quantity. What difference does it make how we express it? Bell leans forward. His voice carries decades of bureaucratic dignity. Young man, you may think of silver in tons, but the Treasury will always think of silver in troy ounces. To understand why Nichols walked into that Treasury office asking for a fortune in silver, you need to understand the impossible problem facing the Manhattan Project in 1942, a problem that seemed to violate the basic rules of chemistry and physics. Scientists knew that uranium-235 was the key to an atomic bomb. When a neutron strikes a uranium-235 nucleus, something extraordinary happens. The atom splits apart. It releases enormous energy and more neutrons. Those neutrons strike more atoms. More splits, more energy, more neutrons. It's a chain reaction that releases power beyond anything humans had ever harnessed. The energy locked inside atomic nuclei had been theoretical for decades. Now scientists understood it could be released, could be weaponized, could end the war. Or lose it, if Germany got there first. But there was a catastrophic problem hiding inside every gram of natural uranium. Imagine you have 1,000,000 marbles. 992,800 of them are blue. Only 7,200 are red. The blue marbles are worthless for your purpose. Only the red marbles work. And here's the impossible part. The blue and red marbles are exactly the same size, exactly the same shape, exactly the same chemical composition. The only difference is that the blue marbles weigh slightly more. That was the uranium problem. Natural uranium contains only 0.72% uranium-235, less than 1%. The rest, 99.28%, is uranium-238. And uranium-238 won't sustain a chain reaction. It absorbs neutrons without splitting. It kills the reaction before it can build. To construct an atomic bomb, you need uranium enriched to at least 90% uranium-235. You need to separate two isotopes that are chemically identical. Same number of protons, same number of electrons, same chemical properties. They react with other elements identically. No chemical process can tell them apart. The only difference between them is 3 neutrons. Uranium-238 has 146 neutrons. Uranium-235 has 143. That's it. 3 neutrons. A mass difference of barely 1%. And that tiny difference is the only thing separating useless metal from the most powerful explosive material on Earth. How do you exploit a 1% mass difference on an industrial scale? How do you sort atoms when chemistry itself cannot distinguish between them? Multiple approaches were being explored. Gaseous diffusion, where uranium hexafluoride gas is pushed through thousands of barriers with microscopic pores. The lighter uranium-235 molecules pass through slightly faster. Do this thousands of times in sequence, and you slowly enrich the mixture. But the barriers kept corroding. The seals kept failing. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. Thermal diffusion used temperature gradients. Hot fluid rises, cold fluid sinks. The lighter isotope concentrates slightly in the warmer regions, but the separation factor was tiny. You'd need columns miles tall to achieve meaningful enrichment. Centrifuges spinning at impossible speeds could separate isotopes by mass, but the centrifuges kept destroying themselves. No material could withstand the forces required. All these methods had problems. All faced staggering technical hurdles. None were guaranteed to work in time to affect the outcome of the war. German scientists were working on the same problem. The race was real. The stakes were civilization itself. Then came a physicist from California with an idea that sounded almost absurd. Ernest Lawrence was not a cautious man. It already revolutionized physics by inventing the cyclotron, a circular particle accelerator that could smash atoms together at unprecedented energies. His laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, was pushing the boundaries of what was possible. In 1941, British physicist Mark Oliphant visited Lawrence with urgent news. Britain's Maud Committee had determined that an atomic bomb was possible. Not theoretically possible, actually buildable. But they needed enriched uranium, and they needed it fast. Faster than any existing method could provide. Lawrence had a wild idea: electromagnetic separation. The principle was elegant. Ionize uranium atoms. Give them an electric charge. Fire them through a powerful magnetic field. The magnetic field deflects the ions in curved paths. But here's the key. The amount of deflection depends on mass. Heavier uranium-238 ions curve less. Lighter uranium-235 ions curve more. If you position collectors at exactly the right spots, you can catch the different isotopes separately. The heavy atoms go one place. The light atoms go another. Separation achieved. It was essentially a mass spectrometer. The same principle scientists use to identify atoms in laboratory samples. But Lawrence wanted to scale it up to industrial proportions. Everyone told him it couldn't work. The beam currents would be too low. The efficiency would be terrible. You'd need impossibly precise control of magnetic fields across enormous volumes. The engineering challenges were insurmountable. Lawrence didn't listen. He converted his old 37-inch cyclotron into the first prototype separator. His team called it the Calutron. California University Cyclotron. On December 2, 1941, 5 days before Pearl Harbor changed everything, the Calutron was switched on for the first time. It worked. A uranium beam of 5 microamperes reached the collector, impossibly small by industrial standards, but proof that the concept was sound. By January 1942, Lawrence's team had produced 18 micrograms of uranium enriched to 25%. 10 times more enriched than any previous method had achieved. The principle was proven. But there was a staggering gap between 18 micrograms in a laboratory and the kilograms of weapons-grade material needed for a bomb. To cross that gap, they would need calutrons by the hundreds. Calutrons the size of buildings. Calutrons that required magnets so massive they would consume more copper than the nation could spare. What happens when you need something that doesn't exist? By mid-1942, Colonel James Marshall and his deputy Kenneth Nichols faced a brutal calculation. To build the electromagnetic separation plant, codenamed Y-12, at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, they would need 5,000 short tons of copper for the magnet windings. Copper was the best electrical conductor available. Copper was essential. But copper was impossible to get. World War II had created an insatiable demand. Electrical wiring for ships, components for aircraft and tanks, communication equipment spanning continents, ammunition casings consuming copper by the trainload. Every industry wanted it. Every military branch needed it. Copper was rationed, controlled, fought over in allocation meetings where generals and admirals competed for scarce resources. The Manhattan Project couldn't get 5,000 tons of copper. Not when the entire war effort was screaming for the same metal. Nichols and Marshall started looking for alternatives. What else conducts electricity almost as well as copper? The answer was surprising. Silver. Silver is actually the most electrically conductive element on Earth. Better than copper, an 11:10 ratio. 11 parts silver could replace 10 parts copper with identical performance. But where do you find thousands of tons of silver in the middle of a world war? There was only one place, the United States Treasury. The Treasury held massive reserves of silver bullion at the West Point Bullion Depository in New York. Tons upon tons of silver bars, each weighing 1,000 troy ounces. This silver backed the nation's currency. It represented the wealth of the American people. It was guarded more carefully than gold. And now the Army wanted to borrow it. For a project they couldn't explain. For machines they couldn't describe. For a weapon they weren't sure would work. If you're starting to see where this is going, hit that like button. The loan was approved, but the conditions were extraordinary. The Treasury insisted on accountability that bordered on obsessive. Every troy ounce would be tracked. Monthly reports were mandatory. Armed guards would accompany every shipment. And at the end of the war, every single ounce would be returned. Daniel Bell wasn't joking about troy ounces. As the Manhattan Project's plans expanded, so did their appetite for silver. The initial request of 6,000 tons grew and grew. Until finally, the total reached 14,700 short tons, approximately 430 million troy ounces. At 1942 prices, this silver was worth over $300 million. In today's currency, nearly $6 billion. It remains one of the largest financial transactions in American history. A government borrowing a fortune from itself to build a weapon nobody was certain would function. The silver arrived at the defense plant in Carteret, New Jersey, in gleaming 1,000-ounce bars. Each bar weighed about 31 kilograms. Heavy, beautiful, worth more than most workers would earn in years. Armed guards watched every movement. Every bar was counted. Every transfer documented. There, the bars were melted down and cast into cylindrical billets. The billets were shipped to Phelps Dodge in Bayway, New Jersey, where massive presses extruded them into strips. Each strip measured 0.625 inches thick, 3 inches wide, and 40 feet long. Silver that had sat in Treasury vaults for decades was being transformed into industrial components. 258 railcar loads of silver strips traveled under armed guard to Alice Chambers in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Their engineers wound the strips onto enormous magnetic coils and sealed them into welded casings. Each completed magnet weighed tons. Each contained enough silver to fund a small town for a year. Then something counterintuitive happened. The finished magnets traveled to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, on completely unguarded flat cars. No armed escorts, no security details, no special precautions. Why? Because the magnets no longer looked like silver. They were anonymous metal casings, industrial equipment, painted gray, bolted shut. Nobody looking at them would suspect they contained a fortune in precious metal. The guards stayed behind. The silver traveled alone. Sometimes the best security is looking ordinary. At Oak Ridge, construction of the Y-12 plant was already transforming the Tennessee landscape. What had been quiet farmland and forest was becoming the largest industrial facility most workers had ever seen. The site covered 825 acres in Bear Creek Valley. The surrounding ridges had been chosen deliberately. If something went catastrophically wrong, if there was an explosion or a nuclear accident, the hills might contain the damage. The workers didn't know this. They just knew they were building something important. The plant would eventually include 9 major process buildings and 200 support structures, nearly 80 acres of floor space. More concrete than most cities used in a decade. More electrical power than some states consumed. The scale was staggering. Nothing like this had ever been attempted anywhere on Earth. The calutrons were arranged in formations called racetracks. When viewed from above, the magnet arrangements formed oval shapes, like the tracks where horses run. Each racetrack contained multiple calutron tanks arranged in series. Alpha racetracks for initial enrichment, beta racetracks for final concentration. Inside each tank, uranium tetrachloride was heated until it vaporized. The vapor was ionized, given an electric charge. Then the ions were accelerated through a vacuum chamber and deflected by 180 degrees by the massive silver wound magnets. The physics worked exactly as Lawrence had predicted. Heavier uranium-238 ions curved less sharply. Lighter uranium-235 ions curved more. They struck different collectors at different positions. Enriched uranium accumulated in one receiver, depleted uranium in another. But turning elegant physics into industrial reality required solving problems nobody had faced before. Stay until the end. The strangest part of this story involves high school girls outperforming PhD scientists. The vacuum tanks weighed 14 tons each. The magnetic forces acting on them were immense. Engineers discovered the tanks would slowly creep out of alignment, sometimes shifting 3 inches. Every misalignment degraded performance. They had to design new fastening systems to hold everything in place. Moisture inside the magnet coils caused short circuits and rust. Magnets had to be torn down, cleaned, dried, and rewound. In a plant where time was measured against the progress of the war, every delay was agonizing. Inside the vacuum chambers, condensation built up. Operators called it gunk and crud. Nobody had predicted it. The deposits blocked precision slits and caused ion beams to lose focus. New cleaning procedures had to be developed from scratch. The ion beams generated intense heat. Despite their microscopic currents, hours of continuous operation could melt the collectors. Engineers added water cooling systems, adding another layer of complexity. And then there was the silver itself. The Treasury's obsessive accounting wasn't theoretical. Kenneth Nichols had to provide monthly reports documenting every troy ounce. The scrutiny was relentless. When workers drilled holes in silver components, they placed paper underneath to catch every filing. At the end of each shift, the paper was collected and sent for silver recovery. When machinery was dismantled for maintenance, every surface was wiped down. The rags were saved and processed. Eventually, they ripped up the floorboards beneath the equipment and burned them. Even microscopic amounts of silver embedded in the wood were recovered from the ash. This wasn't just bureaucratic caution. This was 14,700 tons of the American people's wealth. Every ounce mattered. The first Alpha racetrack became operational in early 1944 after months of debugging. Alpha racetracks performed the initial enrichment, taking natural uranium and raising its uranium-235 concentration. Beta racetracks came next. They took the partially enriched output from the alpha units and enriched it further, pushing toward the 90% purity required for weapons-grade material. The system worked in stages. Each stage multiplied the previous enrichment. Multiple passes through multiple machines, gradually concentrating the precious uranium-235 atom by atom. But running these machines required a workforce unlike any that had existed before. And finding that workforce meant looking in places no one expected. Tennessee Eastman, a chemical company, was contracted to operate the facility. They faced an immediate problem. The usual workforce, young men with technical training, had been drafted into military service. The engineers who understood physics were too few and too valuable to staff control panels around the clock. So they recruited from the surrounding communities. Rural Tennessee, small towns in the Appalachian foothills. They hired thousands of workers, most with only high school educations. Many were young women. Some were barely out of their teens, farm daughters, factory girls, women who had never seen the inside of a laboratory, women who had never heard the word isotope. They became known as the Calutron girls. Picture yourself as one of them. You're 19 years old. You grew up on a farm outside Knoxville. You've seen advertisements for war work, good pay, important jobs, a chance to serve your country without going overseas. You arrive at Oak Ridge and everything feels wrong. The scale is overwhelming. Buildings the size of airplane hangars. Machinery you cannot identify. Security checkpoints everywhere. Armed guards who never smile. You sign documents promising never to discuss what you see. But you don't see anything you understand. You're assigned to a control panel. Dozens of gauges stare back at you, switches, dials. Numbers that mean nothing. Your supervisor explains your job. Watch these meters. Keep these needles in the green zones. If this dial drops, turn this knob. Follow the procedures. Don't ask questions. You ask anyway. What are we making? What do these machines do? Your supervisor's face goes blank. I don't know. Even if I did, I couldn't tell you. Just keep the needles in the green zones. So you do, hour after hour, shift after shift. The calutrons never stop. The war doesn't wait for weekends or holidays. You work days, evenings, nights. You watch needles. You turn knobs. You follow procedures written by people who understand things you never will. You don't know you're separating uranium isotopes. You don't know uranium is a word. You don't know isotopes exist. You do know that the machine humming in front of you contains silver worth more than your entire hometown. You do know that the atoms you're resorting will be assembled into a bomb that will vaporize a city. You just keep the needles in the green zones. The Calutron girls worked 24 hours a day in rotating shifts. 7 days a week. Thousands of them, operating hundreds of control panels, maintaining the precise conditions required for electromagnetic separation to function. Each control panel had dozens of gauges and switches. The job required intense concentration. A small fluctuation in the readings could ruin hours of work. A moment's inattention could waste precious uranium. The operators had to maintain perfect focus for their entire shifts, watching needles that moved in ways they didn't understand, making adjustments they couldn't explain. They were trained, as Nichols later described it, like soldiers not to reason why. And they were incredibly good at it. What happens when understanding becomes an obstacle? Scientists from Berkeley initially operated the calutrons. They were debugging the systems, establishing procedures, documenting optimal settings. Then they handed control to the Tennessee Eastman operators. Nichols began comparing production data between the two groups. What he discovered startled him. The young women operators were outproducing the PhD physicists. Nichols mentioned this to Ernest Lawrence. Lawrence was skeptical. How could high school graduates outperform trained scientists operating the very machines those scientists had invented? They agreed to a production race. Lawrence's Berkeley scientists versus the hillbilly girls, as some had dismissively called them. Lawrence lost. The reason was simple but profound. The scientists couldn't help themselves. When a dial fluctuated, they had to understand why. They would stop production to analyze the problem, form hypotheses, run tests, investigate the underlying physics. The young women, trained to follow procedures without questioning them, simply made the adjustment and moved on. They kept the machines running at peak efficiency while the scientists were still discussing theory. It was a lesson in the difference between understanding and execution. The scientists understood the physics perfectly. The Calutron girls executed the process perfectly. Both skills were valuable. But for keeping calutrons running at maximum output, execution beat understanding. By spring 1945, multiple alpha and beta racetracks were running continuously. The enriched uranium accumulated gram by gram, then kilogram by kilogram. Month after month, the calutrons hummed and the silver magnets generated their invisible fields, and the uranium-235 atoms curved slightly more than their heavier cousins. The calutron girls kept the needles in the green zones. By July 1945, the WWII plant had produced enough enriched uranium-235 for one bomb. Just one. After billions of dollars. After years of work. After 14,700 tons of borrowed silver. Enough fissile material for a single weapon. That uranium became the core of Little Boy, a gun-type atomic bomb designed to achieve critical mass by firing one piece of uranium into another at high speed. The design was so straightforward that scientists were confident it would work without testing. They had only enough uranium for one bomb. They couldn't afford to waste it on a test shot. Little Boy contained approximately 64 kilograms of uranium enriched to about 80%. Uranium-235. Every atom of that uranium-235 had been separated from uranium-238 by the silver magnets at Oak Ridge. Every atom had passed through vacuum chambers tended by young women who didn't know what atoms were. Every atom had been sorted by machines powered by the American people's silver reserves. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay carried Little Boy over Japan. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. When it detonated 1,900 feet above Hiroshima, it released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. A fireball, hotter than the surface of the sun, expanded outward. A shockwave flattened everything in its path. 5 square miles of the city were destroyed in seconds. An estimated 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from burns, injuries, and radiation poisoning in the following months. The atomic age had begun. 3 days later, a plutonium bomb called Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The weapon had worked. The gamble had paid off. The calutrons had achieved their mission. The silver had done its job. Now came the reckoning. After the war, electromagnetic separation was abandoned in favor of gaseous diffusion, which proved more efficient for large-scale production. The calutrons were no longer needed. The machines were dismantled. The magnets were disassembled. The silver had to be returned. Every coil was carefully unwound. Every component was cleaned and processed. These silver strips were recovered, weighed, inventoried against the Treasury's records. Workers ripped up floorboards and burned them, wiped down surfaces and saved the rags, collected every filing, every speck, every trace that could be recovered. In the end, out of 430 million troy ounces loaned, only 155,645.39 troy ounces were unaccounted for, less than 0.036%. The missing silver had been lost to the process itself, vaporized in the ionization chambers. chemically bonded to materials that couldn't be separated, embedded in components beyond recovery. The Treasury was satisfied. The accounting was acceptable. The silver was returned. The final pieces weren't replaced until May 1970, when the last 67 tons of silver were swapped for copper and returned to the Treasury. Nearly 30 years after the initial loan, the debt was finally paid. Years later, after the war had ended and the nature of the Manhattan Project had been revealed, many of the Calutron girls learned for the first time what they had been doing. They had been separating uranium isotopes. They had been enriching material for atomic bombs. They had been helping to build the weapons that destroyed 2 cities and ended the largest war in human history. Some felt pride in their contribution to ending the conflict. Some felt horror at what their work had produced. All were astonished that they had played such a crucial role without ever knowing it. The secret they had kept without knowing they were keeping it had helped reshape the entire world. History had passed through their hands. What does this story mean? Perhaps it's about the strange ways that desperation drives innovation. When copper couldn't be found, silver became the answer. When existing technology couldn't separate atoms, a physicist's wild idea became industrial reality. When trained scientists couldn't maximize production, young women with no scientific education outperformed them. Perhaps it's about the hidden people who shape history. The Calutron girls never appeared in headlines. Their names weren't classified. They were simply unknown. Ordinary workers doing extraordinary work without recognition. The Manhattan Project had famous scientists. It also had thousands of anonymous operators whose contribution was just as essential. Perhaps it's about what we're willing to risk for victory. The United States government gambled nearly $6 billion in today's money on technology that might not have worked. They borrowed the nation's silver reserves for machines that were theoretical when construction began. They bet everything on physics that had only been proven at microscopic scales. They won that bet. But they didn't know they would win when they made it. That's what makes it remarkable. Or perhaps it's simpler than any of that. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible because people refuse to accept that it's impossible. Because a physicist ignores the experts who say his idea won't work. Because a Treasury official approves a loan measured in tons when his department counts in troy ounces. Because young women keep needles in green zones without asking why. Because engineers solve problems they've never faced before with materials never used this way. 14,700 tons of silver. 430 million troy ounces, transformed into magnets. Used to separate atoms, returned almost completely after the war. The calutrons are gone now, dismantled, melted down, returned to the raw materials from which they came. The WWII facility still exists at Oak Ridge, now called the WWII National Security Complex. It no longer enriches uranium, but it remains responsible for maintaining components for every nuclear weapon in America's arsenal. The legacy continues in different form. The silver is back in the Treasury where it belongs. The atoms it separated changed the world forever. And until now, most people had never heard this story. If this changed how you see the Manhattan Project, watch how the Nazis almost got the atomic bomb first, next. Same hidden history, same impossible engineering, same stakes. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. Thanks for watching History of World War II. See you next time.